Alrighty, so in this video what we're going to do is we are going to hook up our server build into Gulp. And we're also going to start work on allowing us to use Nodemon to automatically reload our server every time a new Webpack build comes in. And the cool thing about doing it like this is that we can watch our server for changes and do incremental builds so that Webpack can use its internal caching to make its build super fast, whereas before it had no way to cache modules and all that fun stuff. With this way, only things that changed will be rebuilt. So we're going to need a couple of modules, which is pretty par for the course with Node projects. And the modules that we're going to be working with are going to be, first of all, Gulp, but we're going to do npm install save dev. These are all dev modules. And since, unfortunately, for you future people, Gulp 4 might be out. Unfortunately, right now, it's still not out. So we have to load Gulp.js version 4 directly from GitHub. But fortunately, npm makes that really easy to do. So we simply do Gulp.js /Gulp hash 4.0. And what that's going to do is it's going to go out to GitHub to the Gulp.js person and then grab the repository called Gulp at the 4.0 tag or branch. So we're going to grab Gulp. We're also going to grab Gulp-load-plugins. We're also going to grab Gulp Nodemon, which is obviously it's a Nodemon Gulp plugin that'll allow us to run Nodemon from our Gulp file. And we're also going to grab Chalk and rimraf. So Chalk is a very handy library for formatting colors out to the console, and rimraf is a very handy library for cleaning directories. We want to make sure that our directories are clean in both our server and our client, because Webpack sometimes will output a bunch of stuff that we might not necessarily need. So every time we do a build, we want to make sure to clean it out. And with that, let's go ahead and hit enter. This might take a moment. So if you guys have seen my previous videos, I talked a whole lot about Gulp, talked a little bit about Webpack, so I hope things aren't being repeated too much. I am going to show you some awesome things, though, that we didn't do in the previous series that I hope you'll find as awesome as I do. But don't worry, once we get all this stuff ready and done, we can build the application. I also know that sometimes it's really irritating to take all these tools and configure them, put them together in order to build an application. But when you're building a medium to large sized application, there's no way to get around it. So that's just kind of what you have to do. And it does take time, but again, I encourage people to follow along so that this comes as second nature to people for your own projects. Okay, so one other thing to mention is, I don't know why that's open. Another thing to mention is I also installed Gulp CLI globally, and that allows me to type in just Gulp and hit enter. It'll still use my local installation of Gulp, but having the Gulp command globally available is really nice. So if you already have a version of Gulp that isn't version 4, go ahead and uninstall it by npm uninstall -g gulp. So it's removed from everything, and then go ahead and reinstall the version 4 of the CLI. Now, the version 4 of the CLI will work for projects that are still using Gulp version 3, so you don't have to worry about that. So to install Gulp CLI globally, we simply npm install -g, and then do Gulp.js /Gulp-CLI at version 4.0. So make sure you also grab that. But once you install that, you should be able to go to this directory and type in Gulp and get no Gulp file found. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is going to be awesome. I'm going to create a Gulp file, but I'm not going to name it Gulp file. I am going to name it gulpfile.babel.js. So Gulp has built-in support for Babel, and you can verify that. I can say something like console log and then use a template string hello, and then I can come back over here and I can type in Gulp, and when I do, notice what happens. It says requiring external module Babel core register. So what's going on here is if you call your Gulp file gulpfile.babel.js, we get to use Babel for our Gulp file. And it'll pull in the Babel RC that we have in this folder, meaning we can use ES 2015 code. So I think that's fantastic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import Gulp from Gulp, and I'm also going to, let's see what we need here. We're going to need Gulp. We're going to need Webpack from Webpack. We are going to need Chalk, import Chalk from Chalk. And we're going to need import rimraf from rimraf. We're also going to need Gulp load plugins, but I'm going to do that with a normal require. I'm going to say const money equals require Gulp load dash plugins, and remember to invoke it. If you saw the previous series that I did about module loaders in Gulp, you'll remember that Gulp load plugins exports a function, so you need to invoke it. And what this is going to do is this variable is now going to have all of the packages that start with gulp dash in them. So I don't have to load my plugins individually. Let's say I installed gulp dash cache or something. I can now access it with money.cache, assuming, of course, it was installed. So remember to do that. And that should be what we need. We will need, actually, let's see. I'm going to import, well, let's see how we would do this. We want to also be able to import, under our Webpack server, we want to import this create function. But we need to rename it, because we're going to have also be importing our client Webpack config as well as our server Webpack config. So I'm going to import create server config, or sorry, import create as create server config from webpack.server. So what I'm doing here is I'm simply saying import the create method that's exported from this file, but alias out to create server config so that we can also import another create method from our webpack.client once we make it and rename that to create client config. All right, let's do our cleans first. Our cleans are very simple. So I'm going to go ahead and delineate this part of the file, of the Gulp file, with public tasks. And let's define some Gulp tasks. I'm going to say gulp.task clean : server. And then I'm going to say CB goes into rimraf of build CB. So what's going on here? Well, I'm simply saying rimraf, go ahead and clean out every single file within the build folder. And then when you're done, invoke this callback. And that callback is provided by Gulp, and what it'll do is it'll signal that this task is complete. Next up, let's do gulp task clean : client, and do CB goes into rimraf. Now, we haven't talked about this. This is a client task that I'm defining right now, but we are going to have a folder, and I can create that folder structure right now anyway. It's not a big deal. I can create new folder, public, and under public, we're going to have a folder called build. And this is where our client build is going to go. So we're going to do ./public/build, and then we're going to pass in CB, or callback is the second. And then I'm going to do gulp task clean, which is going to be gulp parallel of clean server and clean : client. So we have a clean server command, which will clean out our server build, clean client, clean out our client build, and then a clean that'll clean out both our server and our client. Let's go ahead and test them. I know I'm getting a bunch of red squigglies from ESLint. Those will go away in time. Gulp doesn't care about ESLint, though, so we don't have to worry about that. So let's test it. Right now we see we have server and server map in our build. Let's go ahead and say gulp clean server and hit enter. And it worked, and build went away. Now let's try cleaning our client. So I'm going to put garbage.txt inside the build folder of our client. And this time I'm going to say gulp clean, and that should invoke gulp clean server and gulp clean client at the same time. And as you see, our build did go away from our public folder. So that should work out just fine. Now what we need to do is we need to do a build server production and a build server development. And for this, I'm going to do this kind of weird. I'm going to take this delineator and put it down here, and I'm going to call this private server tasks. And for private server tasks, I'm going to create a variable that'll just float outside in the global namespace. I'm going to call this Webpack server dev. Or how about dev Webpack server? Or how about dev server Webpack? I like dev server Webpack because Webpack server kind of has a different meaning in Webpack. There is something called the dev Webpack server, and I want to make this variable not get confused with that. And this will simply do equals Webpack create server config false. So I'm invoking Webpack as a function, and I'm passing in a new instantiation of my config. Remember, in our Webpack server.js, we have this create method, this createConf method, and it returns a fully populated Webpack configuration. And that's what we're passing into Webpack. Of course, this isn't going to do anything yet, which is why it's safe to leave this out, even if we're not invoking this at all. It's safe to leave this out in the global namespace. So I'm going to do a function dev server build, which will take in a callback. I'm stubbing these out. You'll see why in a second. And then I'm going to do a prod server build. And we'll leave it like that for now. And then all the way at the bottom, I'm going to create a helpers. And in helpers, I'm going to have a function output Webpack that takes in a label, an error, and stats. For now, my output Webpack is simply going to say, let's say, just something like console log stats to string. We'll talk about output Webpack in a moment here, but I'm trying to stub out all of the functions that we need to write first, and then we'll fill them in a moment. So dev server build and prod server build will both be also exposed as public tasks. Right now, there's no way to use Gulp to invoke these functions, but we can by adding it as a Gulp task. So we can say Gulp task, and I can say dev:server, and this is going to be Gulp series clean:server, followed by dev server build. And then we also want a Gulp task prod:server, which will be the same thing. Gulp series clean:server, and then prod server build. So you kind of see where I'm going with this. I write these methods down here. Also, this needs a callback. That'll be passed in from Gulp. But I define these functions here as reusable functions I can use wherever I want. But then I expose them to Gulp by doing gulp.task. Let's do our dev server build first, because this is really simple. Dev server build is simply going to do dev server webpack.run, and it'll take in a function that gets an error and stats. And all this is going to do is it's going to say output Webpack dev:server error stats, and then we're going to invoke the callback. So what is going on here? Well, remember, we created this Webpack bundler by invoking the Webpack function with our configuration. We assigned it to this variable. And then when we invoke dev server build from this Gulp task, we will invoke the run function on the Webpack bundler. And then it accepts a callback. And that callback will have an error, and it'll have stats. And the error is, well, the error. Something bad happened. And stats is the information about the build. So now we can actually run this, because remember, all Webpack output Webpack does is a console logs out stats.toString, and then we invoke the callback. The callback is passed in from Gulp. When we have a task that doesn't use a Gulp plugin, we have to accept in a callback so we can tell Gulp when we're done with this task. Otherwise, Gulp has no idea when we finished. So now I should be able to come over and type in Gulp dev server and hit enter. And check that out. We got our stats. Oh, first of all, we got the clean, then the clean finished, and then we got all of our Webpack stats written out, and then that finished. And most importantly, our server.js was built up there. So now let's do our prod server build. This will be very similar. We're going to do const prod server webpack equals webpack create server config false, or sorry, true. Whoops, this should be true. The dev server webpack should pass in true to the isDebug flag, whereas the prod server webpack should pass in false. And then we can say webpack prod server webpack dot run error stats goes into output webpack prod server error stats callback. Same thing. Now you might be wondering why I have this up here and this down here. In truth, it doesn't actually matter. I could take this code, instantiation of the production server webpack, and move it up there. The reason why I have it in two different places is I'm going to be reusing the dev server Webpack from my watch task. So I want to make sure that I have access to the dev server Webpack from a different task, which is why I put it out here into the module namespace. But I can do the same thing with prod server Webpack. It doesn't matter. Remember, by instantiating a Webpack bundler, you're not really doing anything. You're not actually causing it to run. But let's go ahead and run our prod task. Gulp prod server. Give it a sec. And it got emitted. And if we check, it will be minified. But if I rerun my dev server, which I'm doing on another monitor right now, it'll be re-emitted, but it won't be minified. So we can tell that the two different configurations did make a difference. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up this output. This is a bit of a mess. So what I'm going to do for that is I am going to pull in another package, and that's going to be gulp-util. So I'm going to say npm install gulp-util --save dev. Gulp-util allows us to log out to Gulp's console logger, which will help improve our output a little bit. So let's just grab gulp-util and give it a sec. Now remember, because gulp-util starts with gulp-, it's going to be loaded in by our gulp load plugin, so we don't have to add another import statement at the top. So now let's clean up our output Webpack. First of all, instead of console log, we're going to do money.util.log. Remember, money.util is going to be automatically loaded in from the gulp-util thing that we just installed. Now let's run our gulp dev server, and the output will be a little different. In this case, our output is a little different because it starts with a timestamp right there, which is exactly what we want. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a couple other things. I'm going to say if error, throw new error, error. So if there was an error, throw the error, and that's going to cause Gulp to understand that there was something messed up. And that's going to help us with debugging our configuration. Next up, I'm going to say if stats has errors, then do something, otherwise do something else. So what's the difference between the error thing that's passed in from webpack.run and the stats has errors? What's the difference? Well, the difference is an error like this is a operational error, like you passed in a wrong configuration, or Webpack just got up and died, or something blew up, or the apocalypse happened, or something. So that's what this error parameter is. But stats can also have errors, and those are the errors that are outputted by things like ESLint or Babel or something like that. It says, okay, your configuration is okay, Webpack did its thing, but you messed up your code somehow. And I'm going to say if stats has errors, then I'm going to say money.util.log stats.toString, but I'm going to pass in an object to the toString, and it's going to be colors is set to true. If there was no error, I'm going to say const time equals stats.endTime minus stats.startTime, and then I'm going to say money.util.log, and now I'm going to use chalk. I'm going to say chalk.bggreen, and I'm going to say built label in time ms. So this makes it so outputs, so Webpack isn't going to output all this garbage that we don't really care about every time there's a successful build. All it's going to do is say, hey, we built a server in X milliseconds. But if there were errors, we want to print those errors out. So now let's run our dev server. So this was a successful build, and check that out. Don't you think that just looks a lot better? But now let's cause there to be an ESLint error. So I'm going to go into source server server, and I'm going to say blah, 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 or sorry, das. Come back here, do this again, and we'll get an ESLint error. But in this case, we get the full output of Webpack that's telling us exactly where that error is. So we don't lose that awesome error reporting, but if no errors happen, we don't fill up our log with a bunch of nonsense. So going from top to bottom, those are our public tasks, our private server tasks, and our helpers. If you want to learn more about Chalk, head on over to npmjs.com/package/chalk, and it'll show you all the different parameters you can use for styling your console output. It's a really handy library. And again, we're only using it here to make the background green when something's built. But with that, I guess in the next video, we're going to take a look at how we can monitor and watch our server and restart it when it changes. So I'll see you guys then.